Most people think change begins with effort, more discipline, better habits, stronger motivation. They believe that if they can just push themselves hard enough, stay consistent enough, or finally get everything right, life will start responding. But that belief alone is often the very thing keeping them stuck. Because the deepest shifts in a person's life do not come from effort. They come from a decision made quietly, internally, often without anyone else ever noticing. There is a moment, subtle and unannounced, where something inside you settles, not with excitement, not with adrenaline, but with clarity. It is the moment you stop negotiating with yourself, the moment you stop waiting for proof, the moment you decide, without tension, without drama, that something is now true about you. That moment is far more powerful than years of trying. Most people never realize how much of their life is being shaped by indecision, masquerading as patience. They say they are being realistic. They say they are waiting for the right time. They say they are working on themselves. But underneath all of that is a quiet refusal to choose, a refusal to assume, a refusal to stand in one inner position long enough for reality to reorganize around it. The inner decision I'm talking about is not a goal. It is not a wish. It is not a plan. It is a choice of identity, a choice of posture, a choice of where you stand internally when nothing around you has changed yet. And this is where most people misunderstand manifestation, growth, and personal transformation. They believe the outer world must change first so that they can feel different inside. But the actual order is the reverse. Every version of your life already exists as a potential. The difference between the version where you struggle and the version where things begin to flow is not intelligence, luck, or effort. It is the decision of which version you are living from internally. Not someday, not eventually. Now. This decision does not shout. It does not demand validation. It does not argue with circumstances. It simply assumes a new position and stays there. And that is why it is so uncomfortable at first. Because the mind wants reassurance. It wants feedback. It wants evidence. But the decision I'm describing is made without evidence. It is made before proof appears. That is what gives it creative power. Think about how many times you have delayed peace, confidence, or trust until something outside of you changed. When I get more money, then I'll relax. When I heal this, then I'll feel safe. When they show up differently, then I'll open up. Each of those statements places the decision outside of you. Each one quietly reinforces the belief that you are not in control of your inner state. But the moment you decide differently, something subtle begins to happen. Your nervous system starts to regulate, your reactions soften, your choices change without force. You stop overcorrecting. You stop chasing signals. You stop trying to extract certainty from the future. And because of that, your behavior becomes coherent, aligned, natural. This is not about pretending nothing is wrong. It is about deciding who you are being while things are still unfolding. It is about choosing steadiness instead of waiting, choosing self-trust instead of monitoring, choosing wholeness instead of improvement. That decision alone begins to reshape how you speak, how you move, how you interpret events, and how others respond to you. Most people are exhausted because they are constantly revisiting the same internal debate. Am I ready? Is this working? What if it fails? What if I'm wrong? The inner decision ends that debate, not by answering every question, but by making the questions irrelevant. When you decide, you stop leaking energy into uncertainty. This is why some people appear calm in the middle of chaos. It's not because they know how everything will work out. It's because they've already decided who they are, regardless of the outcome. That decision stabilizes them. And stability is magnetic. Stability invites solutions. Stability creates space for life to meet you. The inner decision that reshapes everything is the decision to stop outsourcing your state of being, to stop waiting for permission, to stop rehearsing the past and pre-living the future. It is the decision to occupy a new internal ground and remain there gently, consistently, without force. Nothing dramatic happens the moment you decide. And that's the point. The real shifts never announce themselves. They integrate quietly. They settle in. And from that settled place, your entire experience begins to reorganize in ways you could not have planned. This is where the change actually starts. Not with effort, not with struggle, but with a decision that does not ask for approval. Once that inner decision is made, the real work is not in maintaining excitement, it's in maintaining consistency of state. Most people assume that if they don't feel energized or inspired, they must be doing something wrong. But the decision that reshapes everything is not sustained by emotion. It's sustained by calm repetition. It's sustained by returning to the same inner posture again and again, especially on ordinary days when nothing dramatic seems to be happening. This is where many people quietly abandon their power. They mistake neutrality for failure. They think that because they don't feel different enough, something isn't working. But neutrality is not resistance. Neutrality is integration. It is the point where a new assumption stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like truth. And the truth does not need constant emotional reinforcement. When you decide internally, this is who I am now, life does not immediately rearrange itself to congratulate you. Instead, it tests coherence. It brings you moments that would have triggered your old identity, the same conversations, the same delays, the same uncertainties. And the question is not whether those things appear, but whether you meet them from the same inner position or slip back into the old one. This is why the inner decision must be quiet. If it is loud, it depends on validation. If it is dramatic, it depends on momentum. But if it is calm, it can survive friction. And friction is not a sign that the decision was wrong. Friction is often the exact point where the old identity loses its grip. Most people believe that transformation should feel like acceleration. In reality, it often feels like deceleration. Less urgency, less mental noise, less need to explain yourself. When you decide internally, you stop reacting to life as if it is constantly asking you a question. You stop interpreting every event as a sign. You stop checking whether you are on track. You simply live from the decision. This is deeply uncomfortable for the part of the mind that was trained to survive by vigilance. The mind wants to scan. It wants to predict. It wants to control outcomes by staying tense. But the inner decision removes that job. It says, we are no longer managing life from fear. And when fear loses its role, it protests. You may notice thoughts arise that sound practical, but are actually old patterns in disguise. Thoughts like, I should probably do more, or maybe I need another technique, or what if I'm being complacent? These thoughts are not warnings. They are echoes. They are remnants of an identity that believed effort was safety. You don't need to fight them. You simply don't need to obey them. The decision reshapes everything because it changes how you relate to uncertainty. Instead of seeing uncertainty as a threat, you begin to experience it as openness. Instead of feeling like you're behind, you begin to feel like you're unfolding. That shift alone changes the quality of your actions. You still act, you still respond, but your actions are no longer driven by panic or proving. They come from clarity. This is where practical change begins to emerge without force. You say no more easily. You pause before overcommitting. You stop explaining yourself to people who are not listening. You notice when something feels misaligned and you don't override that feeling anymore. These are not dramatic changes, but they compound quickly. The inner decision also changes how you experience time. When you are undecided, time feels heavy, urgent, pressurized. When you decide, time softens. You stop rushing toward relief. You stop feeling like life is something you need to catch up to. And paradoxically, this is when things begin to move. People often ask how long it takes for life to reflect an inner decision. The honest answer is that life is always reflecting it. But the reflection is subtle at first. It shows up as reduced resistance, cleaner choices, less internal conflict. And those internal shifts create external openings naturally. The mistake is waiting for the outer world to validate the decision before fully inhabiting it. That turns the decision back into a condition. The power comes from remaining in the decision even when nothing seems to confirm it yet. Not with stubbornness, with steadiness. This is how the inner decision becomes embodied. It moves from an idea into a lived orientation. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You're simply no longer negotiating who you are. And when that negotiation ends, energy returns, focus returns, presence returns. Part 2 of this shift is learning to stay with the decision without needing it to feel special, without narrating it, without proving it, just living from it quietly until it becomes the most natural thing in the world. As the decision settles, something subtle but important begins to happen. Your attention starts to reorganize itself. You notice that you are no longer scanning life for confirmation in the same way. You're not constantly asking whether something is working, whether you are aligned, whether you are falling behind. That constant internal monitoring starts to loosen. And when it does, a surprising amount of mental energy becomes available. This is where clarity replaces effort. Not clarity as in having all the answers, but clarity as in knowing what no longer requires your participation. You begin to recognize which thoughts are simply habits rather than guidance. You see how often the mind repeats familiar narratives, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. And instead of engaging those narratives, you let them pass without assigning meaning to them. This is not detachment from life. It is detachment from unnecessary interpretation. When you stop interpreting every thought as important, your inner world becomes quieter. And in that quiet, intuition becomes easier to hear. Decisions stop feeling heavy. You don't deliberate endlessly. You sense when something fits and when it doesn't, and you trust that sensing without needing to justify it. At this stage, the inner decision starts expressing itself through restraint. You don't chase clarity, you don't rush outcomes, you don't push conversations to resolve faster than they need to. You allow situations to reveal themselves. This patience is not passive. It is informed. It comes from knowing that forcing clarity often distorts it. You may notice that you respond differently to obstacles. Instead of tightening internally, you pause. Instead of immediately fixing, you observe. This pause is powerful. It creates space between stimulus and response. And in that space, you are no longer operating from habit. You are choosing. This is one of the most practical shifts you can make. When something doesn't go as planned, resist the urge to immediately explain it to yourself. Don't label it as failure. Don't turn it into a story about your progress. Simply notice what it evokes and let that reaction pass before deciding what to do next. That alone prevents countless self-sabotaging actions. The inner decision also changes how you relate to desire. Desire no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like information. Instead of asking, how do I get this? You begin to ask, what state would naturally include this? That question shifts your focus from strategy to alignment, from tactics to embodiment. You don't need to visualize constantly. You don't need to affirm endlessly. What matters more is the baseline you return to when you're not trying. Pay attention to how you feel when you're doing nothing in particular. That is the state you are practicing most often. And that state is what life responds to. This is where simplicity becomes your advantage. Instead of adding more techniques, you subtract interference. You notice when you're mentally rehearsing problems that haven't happened. You notice when you're bracing for disappointment out of habit. And gently, without force, you stop doing that. Not because you're trying to be positive, but because you see that it's unnecessary. As this continues, your sense of identity becomes less reactive. You don't need to defend who you are. You don't need to compare your timing to anyone else's. You don't need to convince yourself that you're on the right path. You feel grounded enough to let things unfold without commentary. This is when life starts responding differently. Not dramatically at first, but cleanly. Conversations become more straightforward. Opportunities appear without urgency attached to them. You find yourself acting at the right moment instead of every moment. And those actions carry weight because they are not rushed. The inner decision reshapes everything because it changes the quality of your attention. Where your attention goes without effort is where your life grows. And when attention is no longer hijacked by doubt, by anticipation, by mental noise, it becomes steady. That steadiness is what allows results to emerge without strain. This part of the process is not about doing more. It's about doing less, but doing it from a clearer place. Less mental rehearsal, less emotional overreaction, less identity maintenance. And in that simplicity, something powerful takes root. You begin to trust yourself again, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with the process. You are living from the decision instead of waiting for it to prove itself. And that is when the shift becomes irreversible. As this steadiness deepens, you begin to notice a quiet confidence forming beneath the surface, not the kind that needs to announce itself or prove anything, but the kind that feels settled. You're no longer negotiating with yourself every time something matters. You don't have to psych yourself up or talk yourself into belief. There is a sense that you are already standing on solid ground, and from that ground, you can move naturally. This is where consistency replaces intensity. Instead of short bursts of motivation followed by exhaustion, your actions become even. You show up without drama. You do what makes sense without needing emotional momentum to carry you. This is one of the most overlooked advantages of the inner decision. When you are no longer chasing a result to validate you, you stop burning energy unnecessarily. Your effort becomes efficient. You may also notice that your relationship with time changes. Urgency softens. You are still aware of your desires, but they no longer feel like deadlines hanging over you. Time becomes something you work with, not against. This alone removes a tremendous amount of pressure that previously distorted your choices. Here is something practical to observe. Notice how often impatience disguises itself as action. Many people move quickly, not because it is aligned, but because waiting feels uncomfortable. The inner decision changes this. You become willing to wait when waiting is wise, and willing to move when movement is clean. That discernment saves you from detours that cost months or years. As this unfolds, your emotional landscape evens out. Highs are not as frantic. Lows are not as consuming. This does not mean you stop feeling. It means feelings move through you without defining you. When something triggers frustration or doubt, it no longer pulls you into a spiral. You feel it, recognize it, and continue without building a story around it. This emotional regulation is not discipline. It is understanding. You understand that emotions are feedback, not commands. They tell you where attention has drifted, not what reality is. And because you are no longer reacting to every internal signal, you stay oriented towards what matters. Another practical shift appears in how you speak, both internally and outwardly. Your language becomes simpler. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop narrating your progress. You stop announcing what you are working on before it is ready. There is power in containment. Energy held quietly tends to organize more effectively than energy scattered through constant expression. This containment is not secrecy. It is respect for the process. You begin to trust that what is forming does not need validation while it is forming. This alone stabilizes your momentum. Fewer leaks, fewer interruptions, fewer moments of second-guessing caused by external opinions. You also start to notice that your standards shift, not in a rigid way, but in a clear way. You are less willing to entertain distractions that pull you away from your center. You say no more easily. You disengage sooner. You recognize when something does not align, and you do not try to force compatibility. This is deeply connected to manifestation, even though it does not look like a technique. When you are clear internally, you stop entertaining realities that do not match your decision. You're no longer oscillating between states. And reality responds most strongly to consistency of state. Pay attention to what you tolerate. What you repeatedly tolerate becomes part of your lived experience. The inner decision sharpens your awareness here. You don't tolerate chaos out of familiarity. You don't tolerate scarcity thinking out of habit. You don't tolerate self-doubt as a personality trait. You see these patterns, and without hostility, you withdraw your agreement. This withdrawal is powerful. You are no longer feeding the old loops with attention, and what is not fed loses influence. Over time, those patterns weaken not because you fought them, but because you stopped participating in them. As this continues, your actions begin to feel inevitable rather than forced. You take steps because they are obvious, not because you are trying to prove commitment. You prepare because preparation makes sense, not because you fear missing out. You refine your skills because refinement feels natural, not because you think you are behind. This is the paradox. When you stop trying to control outcomes, your influence over outcomes increases because your energy is no longer fragmented. It is coherent, focused, calm, directed. And that coherence is what reshapes everything. Not through effort, but through alignment with the decision you have already made. As this alignment settles in, you begin to recognize something subtle but important. You're no longer measuring your progress by how you feel moment to moment. You're no longer asking yourself whether you feel confident enough, motivated enough, or inspired enough to continue. The inner decision has already answered those questions. You move forward regardless of emotional weather, not by suppressing feelings, but by no longer letting them dictate direction. This is where real stability forms. When your movement is no longer dependent on feeling good, you stop stalling every time discomfort appears. Discomfort becomes information, not a stop sign. You notice it, adjust if needed, and continue. This alone changes how long it takes for things to materialize, because most delays are caused by emotional hesitation rather than external obstacles. You also begin to see how often you used to negotiate with yourself. Small internal debates would drain energy. Should I do this now or later? Should I wait until I feel more ready? Should I try something else instead? The inner decision removes the negotiation. You already know who you are being now, so choices become simpler. Not always easy, but simple. There is a practical way to strengthen this. Each day, choose one small action that aligns with the version of you that already decided. Not a dramatic leap. Something ordinary. Something sustainable. Then do it without commentary. No internal hype. No pressure. Just execution. Over time, these actions build trust with yourself. And self-trust is one of the strongest foundations for change. As that trust builds, you stop seeking reassurance from the outside. You are less concerned with whether others approve, agree, or understand. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you anchored. You no longer need agreement to move. You no longer need encouragement to continue. You are guided from within. This inner anchoring affects manifestation directly. When you are no longer scanning the environment for confirmation, you stop broadcasting uncertainty. You stop signaling that you are waiting for permission. Instead, you move as someone who already assumes their direction is valid, and that assumption quietly rearranges how opportunities meet you. Another shift appears in how you relate to effort. Effort is no longer about forcing results. It becomes about presence. When you are present with what you are doing, quality improves. You make fewer careless decisions. You notice details. You respond rather than react. This increases effectiveness without increasing strain. It is also worth noticing what falls away during this phase. You may lose interest in constant consumption of advice, techniques, and motivational content, not because it is wrong, but because you no longer need external stimulation to stay oriented. You have an internal reference point now. You know what you're doing and why. This is a sign of integration. The ideas are no longer concepts you revisit. They're operating principles. You're not thinking about changing your life. You're living differently. And life responds to lived states far more than it responds to intellectual understanding. When challenges arise, and they will, you meet them from a different posture. You are not asking why this is happening to you. You are asking how to move through it cleanly. You are not dramatizing the moment. You are using it. Every challenge becomes a refinement point rather than a setback. This is where many people unknowingly turn back. Not because things fall apart, but because things stop feeling dramatic. The nervous system misses the intensity, but growth at this level is quiet. It feels normal. And that normalcy is actually evidence that the inner decision has taken root. You begin to live as if stability is your baseline, not something you earn after success arrives. And from that baseline, success becomes a byproduct rather than a goal you chase. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing the friction that kept interrupting who you already were capable of being. The inner decision does not add power. It organizes it. And as that organization continues, the outer world starts to mirror it in practical ways. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, clearly, in ways that hold. You are no longer reshaping everything by effort. You are reshaping it by consistency of state. And that is far more powerful than intensity ever was. At this point, something becomes very clear. The life you are building is no longer fragile. It is no longer dependent on perfect timing, ideal circumstances, or constant emotional highs. It is grounded, and that grounding is the result of the inner decision holding steady over time, not because nothing challenged it, but because nothing was allowed to replace it. You begin to notice that the outer world responds differently when your inner posture is settled. Situations that once felt chaotic no longer pull you into reaction. Conversations that once triggered doubt or defensiveness now pass through you with less friction. You are not detached from life. You are engaged without being entangled. That distinction matters more than most people realize. This is where manifestation stops feeling like something you are doing and starts feeling like something that is happening through you. Not because you are passive, but because your state is coherent. When your thoughts, actions, and expectations are no longer contradicting each other, outcomes stop feeling random. Life begins to move with a certain rhythm. Not always fast, but reliable. There is also a quiet confidence that forms here, not the loud kind that needs to be seen, but the kind that shows up in how you carry yourself. You stop over-explaining. You stop rushing to justify your choices. You stop needing immediate results to validate your direction. You trust your pace because it is no longer borrowed from anyone else's timeline. From a practical standpoint, this is where patience becomes active rather than passive. You continue taking aligned actions while allowing results to mature in their own time. You do not abandon your direction just because something has not shown up yet. You understand that some outcomes require stability before they can land. And you are now stable enough to hold them. The inner decision also changes how you define success. It is no longer measured only by external milestones, but by how consistently you remain centered while moving toward them. You start to value clarity over speed, integrity over appearance, alignment over applause. These priorities reshape not only what you achieve, but how you experience achieving it. There is a natural generosity that emerges as well. When you're no longer fighting yourself internally, you have more space for others. You listen more fully. You respond more thoughtfully. You contribute without needing recognition. This generosity is not self-sacrifice, it is overflow. And overflow is one of the clearest signals that your inner state has shifted. At this stage, the question is no longer whether the inner decision works. You have lived the evidence. The question becomes whether you will continue honoring it when things feel ordinary. Because this is where lasting change lives. Not in constant breakthroughs, but in sustained embodiment. Nothing about this requires perfection. You will still have moments of doubt, fatigue, and frustration. The difference now is that these moments no longer define you. They pass through without taking the wheel. You return to center more quickly. You recover faster. You move on without turning every misstep into a story. This is what it means for one inner decision to reshape everything. It does not rewrite your life overnight. It rewires how you meet each moment. And over time, that changes everything you touch. The power was never in the decision itself. It was in your willingness to live from it quietly, consistently, and without waiting for permission. That is where transformation becomes real. And from here, there is nothing to chase. There is only something to continue.